Welcome back to the channel. Today we're talking about Benny Morris's 1948, The First Arab-Israeli War. And this book review has actually been a long time coming. He was the number one author in all of the comments section for my very first review on the Palestinian issue when I did Ilan Pappé's Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And all throughout the comment section, Benny Morris says that Ilan Pappé is a liar. Benny Morris is the only acceptable historian. And the reason why Benny Morris is acceptable to the Zionists is because he has politically correct views about Israel. But I have very bad news for any Zionists who searched up Wikipedia and other news articles to leave comments on my first Ilan Pappé video. Morris, not just in this book, but in his book, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited, destroys the narrative that is taught in Israeli schools. The narrative that poor little Israel was invaded simultaneously by 6 different armies who threatened to push them into the sea. I already dealt with these arguments on a country-by-country basis in my book review on the war in Palestine, which I'll put a card up to. But it's also dealt with quite comprehensively in this book by Morris. And Morris is an Israeli. So the other part of this is a military history book. So it's about a war that happened in 1948. So Morris goes into detail on battles, weapons used, maps, maneuvers, command and control, who was commanding which armies. So if you're interested in that and you want to see all the maps and all the maneuvers, you're going to get that. And I enjoyed that. But I was here mostly for the larger political and personal issues, which Morris delivers in full, I think. So part 1 of this review, as it is with a lot of these larger books, I can't do everything in one review. I have to split it into parts. So this is part 1, and it's going to deal with the end of the British Mandate in 1947, leading up to 1948. April is when the British really start pulling out in different places. And so part 1 will take us from this period all the way to the first truce of the war in June 1948. Part 2 will take us from beyond that to the armistice agreements in 1949, but we'll get to that then. Let's get started with this. So this is, I would say, a warning from a Zionist educator named Yitzhak Epstein in 1907. The article that this is from is titled "The Hidden Question," in which Epstein acknowledged the emergence of a national conflict between Zionism and the Arabs. "We have forgotten one small matter," he berated the Zionist leadership. "There is in our beloved land an entire nation, which has occupied it for hundreds of years and has never thought to leave it. We are making a great psychological error with regard to a great, assertive, and jealous people. We forget that the nation that lives in Palestine today has a sensitive heart and a loving soul. The Arab, like every man, is tied to his native land with strong bonds. Zionism," he warned, "would have to face and solve the Arab question." And he urged the settlers to get to know the Arabs, their culture, and their language to facilitate dialogue. And as we've covered in previous reviews, there were very few among the Zionists who were even willing to entertain this, even mildly. Remember, we've talked about in previous reviews that the British set a divide and rule strategy, as they did in many of their colonies, by pitting leading families against each other. Remember, we've talked about the Al-Nashashibis and the Al-Alis. In reality, what characterized Arab Palestine during the Mandate was a feudal 2-party system, which, with the Husseinis pitted against the opposition. It was a struggle for power and its benefits, not an ideological clash. Though the Husseinis, almost from the start, painted their opponents as collaborators with British rule and soft on Zionism. The Nashashibis, though also ultimately desirous of political independence for Palestine under Arab rule, appeared to be more moderate than the Husseinis, whom the British and Zionists branded as extremists. Throughout the Mandate, the leading Arab families, including Husseinis and opposition figures, sold land to the Zionists despite their nationalist professions. Jewish landholding increased between 1920 and 1947 from 456 dunams to about 1.4 million dunams. The main brake on Jewish land purchases, at least during the 1920s and 1930s, was lack of funds, not any Arab indisposition to sell. Moreover, hundreds of Arabs collaborated with the Zionist intelligence agencies. I've talked before in other reviews that the main Zionist argument to the Arabs, the few times that they were willing to talk to them, was that, hey, the Jews are an industrious, hardworking people. We're going to come and make this better for everybody. Get on board the Zionist train, and we're going to make things great. The Zionists consistently insisted on continued immigration and Jewish statehood. Ben-Gurion argued that the Jewish influx would better the condition of the Arabs as well as the Jews. Musa al-Alami, a leading Palestinian moderate and an assistant mandate attorney general, countered, "I would prefer that the country remain impoverished and barren for another 100 years until we ourselves are able to develop it on our own." And Arab nationalists outside Palestine were no more amenable to an accommodation. At a meeting in 1936 between JA representatives, al-Quwatli countered. Al-Quwatli at the time was the leader of the Syrian National Bloc, but he would become one of the first presidents of Syria. "What is the use of economic well-being if we are not masters in our own home?" And so that argument that the Yishuv wanted to make, which was, hey, we're going to make things better for everybody, the Arabs were not interested in that. For better or for worse, that's not right or wrong. The idea is, oh, well, money is everything. Economics is everything. People are willing to reject economic betterment for self-determination. And I think that not only is that noble, but I think people should think about that more in our age, which is so focused on money. We've talked about this in previous reviews, but again, the idea of the Arab revolt between 1936 and 1939 was that this was a premature war against the wrong enemy. They took on the British. A lot of their best were killed. The leaders were exiled. And that was years before this war. And Morris echoes what others have said here. Somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 of their political and military activists had been killed, with many thousands more either driven into exile or jailed. The leadership of the Palestine Arab National Movement was decimated, exiled, or jailed, and a deep chasm, characterized by blood feuds, divided the society's elite families. Indeed, much of the elite was so disillusioned or frightened by what had happened that it permanently renounced political activity. The Palestinians had also suffered serious economic harm through both the general strike and British repression. They had prematurely expended their military power against the wrong enemy and had been dealt a mortal blow in advance of the battle with the real enemy, Zionism. The damage to their war effort in 1947 to 1948 was incalculable. So that gets us up to partition. Now, remember partition, just as was the case with the Balfour Declaration, which is characterized as one country promising the land of another country to a third country. So we're beyond that, and now we're to the British having gotten tired of Palestine no longer wanting to take responsibility for it. They dumped this in the laps of the UN. The UN, subject to Zionist lobbying, put together a majority report in favor of the Zionists, unsurprisingly. The chief unanimous recommendations were the termination of the mandate at the earliest possible time and the granting of independence to Palestine. The majority, the representatives of Sweden, Holland, Canada, Uruguay, Guatemala, Peru, and Czechoslovakia, proposed partition, with an enclave under international control consisting of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. The Jewish and Arab states were to be bound in economic union, were to function as one economic entity, and the British would continue to administer the country for 2 years, during which 150,000 Jews would be allowed into the Jewish designated areas in monthly quotas. During the first year of independence, the inhabitants of each state desiring to move to its neighbor would be free to do so. As it stood, the Jewish state, according to UNSCOP, was to have 500,000 Jews and 416,000 Arabs, along with some 90,000 Bedouins who were not counted as permanent residents. The Corpus Separatum of Jerusalem-Bethlehem was to have a population of 200,000, half Jewish and half Arab. The Arab state was to have some 700,000 Arabs and 8,000 Jews. The proposed arrangement was described as the most realistic and practical possible. While that may sound good on paper, I want to remind everybody of the map. those are not borders that can be easily patrolled, and you basically got people on both sides of each line. So it's not the most desirable solution. I don't want to beat up on the UN people for trying to come up with a solution when it was presented to them. Whether the UN should have had any jurisdiction here, that's obviously a separate conversation. And whether they ruled so favorably for the Zionists, that's a different question. But I want people to know that this on its own was already a problematic solution. But if we have to think in terms of a solution, it's going to be something that not everyone is pleased with, and that might be an indication that it is a good solution. If both parties feel that they're unhappy or even quite unhappy with the solution, it's better than one party being very happy and another party not being happy at all. If both parties feel similarly aggrieved, it means you're probably pretty close. In this particular case, the Jews were over the moon. Look at all the dotted, that is all allocated to the Jewish state, even though they were an overwhelming minority of the population. They were allocated all of that land. It's nuts. So it was clearly an unjust proposal, but it was a proposal. So let's give that some kind of credit. So that was the majority opinion. The UNSCOP minority proposal, penned by the Yugoslav, Iranian, and Indian representatives, was for Palestine to be given independence as a federal state with locally governed separate Jewish and Arab autonomous areas, which they confusingly called states. Its frills removed, the proposal charted the establishment of a unitary state under Arab domination to be established after a 3-year transitional period. Jewish immigration was to be allowed only to the 2 Jewish areas, limited to the coastal plain and part of the northern Negev, and overall was to be curtailed by the federal authorities in a manner that always left the Arabs with a countrywide majority. And this is obviously the most just solution, right? That self-determination, as we saw with all the other mandates, the majority rule created their states, but this was not to be. So what was the Arab reaction to this? The Arab reaction was predictable. The blood will flow like rivers in the Middle East, promised Jamal Husseini. Haj Amin al-Husseini, Mufti, went one better. He denounced even the minority report, which in his view legitimized the Jewish foothold in Palestine, a partition in disguise, as he put it. Remember that the Mufti wanted immigration to be rolled back to 1917 or even 1914. So if you were not in the land before 1917, you couldn't stay. You were going to have to leave, which I think is problematic. As much as I am opposed to the Zionist project, I don't think that this was a way that realistically could have been dealt with the emergence of the League of Nations and with the emergence of the United Nations. The international community was not going to allow it, and there were going to be sanctions and there were going to be problems. But the Arabs also seem to have this sort of delusional historical view of Saladin as this is how it is. So because centuries ago, when there was a single unified Muslim Arab caliphate, which quote unquote drove out the Crusaders, people forget it took a long time to quote unquote drive out the Crusaders, and it was under single command and control under a military genius, one of the most gifted military geniuses of all time, Saladin. They kept thinking this is how it is. And so this is the Arab Secretary General. He says, centuries ago, the Crusaders established themselves in our midst against our will, and in 200 years we ejected them. Up to the very last moment and beyond, they will fight to prevent you from establishing your state. In no circumstances will they agree to it. So I say, fine, if you want to have the view it took 200 years to expel the Crusaders, that's fine. But there was the only reason the quote-unquote Crusaders were expelled is because there was unified command and control, and that has never been the case with Palestine, ever. And in fact, it's one of the reasons that the Palestinians are in the situation that they're in is because the Arabs are so divided. The British saw the majority report as grossly unfair to the Arabs. Alexander Cadogan, the UK's representative to the United Nations, commented, "The majority plan is so manifestly unjust to the Arabs that it is difficult to see how we could reconcile it with our conscience." So that's what's going on with partition. Now, as I've said, the Arab response to this is a totalist response. absolutely not. We're not going to have anything to do with it. And I think going further, we're not going to recognize any Jews, any state of Israel. So it was I don't say scorched earth, because at the time it wasn't. It was rhetorical scorched earth. They hadn't done any invasions, but the idea was we cannot compromise at all. And they didn't come up with any solutions. So when the UN tried to come up with other solutions, the Arab response was always just no, and no counter proposal. It was no, all the Jews have to leave, and that's the end of it. Whatever may have been the case of justice, which I've already acknowledged, there has to be a question of practicality when it comes to politics. Politics is the art of the possible. It's not always in fact, it's almost never the art of the just. And so the Palestinians, understandably, were focused on the justice aspect of this. So were the Arabs. But they failed to see how can they reconcile justice with what's possible and what was happening, which is Zionist takeover of the political capitals of the world. So the Arabs' main tactic amounted to blackmail, the promise or threat of war should the assembly endorse partition. Fawaz al-Kawuji, soon to be named the head of the Arab League's volunteer army in Palestine, the Arab Liberation Army, threatened that should the vote go the wrong way, we will have to initiate total war. We will murder, wreck, and ruin everything standing in our way, be it English, American, or Jewish. Not exactly a way to win friends and influence people, right? Palestinian reaction. One Palestinian historian said they could not fathom why 37% of the population had been given 55% of the land, of which they owned only 7%. So we've seen some of these statistics before in Rashid Khalidi's Iron Cage. If you want to get deeper into those statistics, that book is full of them. What was the goal of the planned invasion? Arab spokesmen indulged in a variety of definitions. A week before the armies marched, Azam told Kirkbride, "It does not matter how many Jews there are. We will sweep them into the sea." Syrian President Shukri al-Quwatli spoke of the Crusades. Overcoming the Crusaders took a long time, but the result was victory. There is no doubt that history is repeating itself. Ahmad Shukeri, one of Haj Amin al-Husseini's aides and later the founding chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, simply described the aim as the elimination of the Jewish state. So again, not an idea of we're going to secure our people, we're going to make sure that we're taken care of. It's we're also going to invade the Jewish areas and kill all of them. And that's what the words were. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying this is what was said at the time and is being documented. From the start, the invasion plans had failed to assign any task whatsoever to the Palestinian Arabs or to take account of their political aspirations. I talked about this in my review on the book, The War for Palestine, that the Palestinians were excluded from participation in organizing and directing the war, which was apparently for them. Although the Arab leaders vaguely alluded to a duty to, quote, save the Palestinians, none of them seriously contemplated the establishment of a Palestate with Husseini at its head. All the leaders loathed Husseini. All, to one degree or another, cared little about Palestinian goals, their rhetoric notwithstanding. It was with this in mind that Jordan, on the eve of the invasion, ordered the ALA out of the West Bank and subsequently disarmed the local Arab militias. Remember, we talked about this before, that Abdullah had a separate secret deal with the Israelis. He wanted to take over the West Bank and make it part of Jordan. Also think about the motivations. The Jews recently expelled from Europe, were fighting for the only land that they really had. Their families were living there. They were defending their new land, as it was, which they had these ideas about tying back thousands of years. The soldiers of the Arab armies were less motivated. Though keen on defeating the Jews, seen as religious infidels and political usurpers, and helping their Palestinian brothers, they did not view the war as an existential proposition. That's what the Jews saw it as, like, we have to fight or we're going to die. The Arabs did not see it the same way. Their states, villages, and towns and families were not under real threat. Most of the army were in the home countries. There was only a small expeditionary force from a lot of these countries there. In defeat, they could still return to hearth and home. The Arab soldiers were invaders, fighting a long way from home for a remote and somewhat abstract cause. This gap in motivation was to tell on the battlefield, especially in May and June, when small Jewish units with rifles and Molotov cocktails, and I think in one case in particular in Jerusalem, 14 and 15-year-old Jewish kids, staved off far larger Arab forces backed by armor and artillery, as in Kibbutz Nirim and Kibbutz Degania Aleph. So the Arabs were not prepared for the Jewish response, and they wrote them off. They are not competent. We'll sweep them into the sea. Edward Said talked about this before, that this was something he heard growing up as a kid. We'll just take some sticks or some brooms and we're going to wipe them away. And this was just not the case. How did the British prepare to leave? They basically tried to help both sides to one way or the other, although remember, the hand had been heavily on the scales for the Zionists for almost all of the mandate. The guideline of impartiality authorized by British cabinet decision on 4 December 1947 translated during the following months into a policy of quietly assisting each side in the takeover of areas in which that side was demographically dominant. In practice, this meant the handover, as the British successively withdrew from each area, of mandate government installations, Tel Aviv in December 1947, Gaza in February 1948, and so on. Police forts, military camps, utilities, to the majority community's control. The police forts and camps in the hill country of Judea, Samaria, and Galilee, remember Judea and Samaria is what we know as the West Bank. Galilee generally were turned over to Arab militia commanders. Installations in the coastal plain and the Jordanians went to the Haganah, which would later become the IDF. This policy sometimes occasioned a more radical expression, British advice, or urging to specific threatened or defeated communities to evacuate. For example, on 18 April 1948, the British urged the Arab inhabitants of Tiberias to evacuate the town. A week later, they proffered the same advice in Balad ash-Sheikh, an Arab village southeast of Haifa. In the course of January through May 1948, the British periodically urged the small Jewish communities north of Jerusalem, Neve Yaakov and Atarot, to clear out, as they did the inhabitants of the 4 kibbutzim of the Etzion block south of Bethlehem. So the British are trying to give advice to both sides, even though they're the ones who precipitated this whole thing and then handed off this hot potato to the United Nations because they were too cowardly to deal with it. The cycle of violence continues. Remember that we had some of this violence, Hebron, Nebi Musa, all throughout before the Arab Revolt, but it's starting to come out even stronger now. And so I just wanted, there's a lot more examples in the book, but I'm just going to take 2 examples, one from each side, just to show that there were attacks and then there were retaliatory attacks. Both religions are big into revenge, right? Both Islam and Judaism are big into eye for an eye. They're Abrahamic religions, and that's where they're stuck. And so part of that is they see this as totally normal. Like most intercommunal wars, this too was marked by cycles of revenge. On the morning of 30th December, an IZL squad threw bombs from a passing van into a crowd of casual Arab laborers at a bus stop outside the Haifa oil refinery, killing 11 and wounding dozens. So there's a bus stop outside this refinery. A bunch of Arabs are killed. So in response, in a spontaneous response inside the plant, Arab refinery employees, reinforced by laborers from outside, using sticks, metal bars, stones, etc., turned on their Jewish co-workers, mostly white-collar employees, and in an hour-long rampage, butchered 39 and wounded another 50. Several Arab employees protected Jews. The British refinery executives and security officers refused to intervene or give the Jews arms from the plant's armory, though a number of British workers saved Jews. The massacre was halted by the arrival of British forces, who then allowed the Arabs to be bussed out. So, cycle of violence, Jewish terrorist bomb hits an Arab bus stop. This word spreads inside the factory. They then attack the Jews. Mapam leader, so Mapam's, let's say, a more peace-oriented, at the time, I don't even know if Mapam is still around. Is Mapam? I'd have to look into that. By the time Mapam criticized this, criticized the indiscriminate nature of the retaliation, Ben-Gurion responded that to discriminate in such circumstances is impossible. We're at war. There is an injustice in this, but otherwise we will not be able to hold out. So that's the situation leading up to the war. Is we have the plan for partition, the Arab reaction to it, the British response, and now we have to look at potentially what's the most controversial part of Benny Morris's position in this book, which is his insistence over and over that there was no unified plan from the top that said our plan is to expel all of the Arabs. Now, why he holds on to this as so important, I don't get, because the idea that all things in life have to be carried out by a single military order from above is crazy. Times in which things happen due to spontaneous urges, or you watch everybody do the same thing and then you do it. And there's that famous sociological video in which people are shown this picture, and one line is clearly not longer than the other, but these people are planted to say, oh, this line is wronger. And the person over time, even though they think it's wrong, they side with the majority. So what we were seeing over and over, and Morris gives evidence for this, legions of evidence, is a certain mode of conduct was happening with the Haganah and the other terrorist organizations, which was expulsion, destruction of the villages, killing of civilians. This was happening over and over, and it wasn't being punished. So an idea spreads over time that this is what we're supposed to do. So Morris says, well, since there isn't a unified plan, we can't really say that this was the plan. When the reality is, look at the evidence. And the weird thing is, he's the one presenting the evidence to us. So I'm going to read you all of his evidence, and then I'm going to read you my LOL quote from him. Okay, so let's start here. Henceforward, and this is after March of 1948, okay? Henceforward, Haganah policy would be permanently to secure roads, border areas, and Jewish settlements by crushing minatory irregular forces and destroying or permanently occupying the villages and towns from which they operated. The Arab militias and their ALA reinforcements had to be crushed. The main roads had to be permanently secured, and the Haganah's brigades had to be free to deploy along the borders to fend off the expected pan-Arab invasion. In addition, the world, and particularly the United States, had to be persuaded that the Yishuv could and would win and establish its state. Victory over the Palestinian Arabs would assure the world communities continued adherence to the decision to partition Palestine and establish a Jewish state. Glimmers of the prospective change in strategy were apparent in the first months of 1948. In January, planning in the Haganah Jerusalem district provided for the destruction of villages, dominating our settlements, or endangering our communication routes. And in Tel Aviv, one senior officer recommended destroying Jaffa's water reservoir to force a large number of Arabs to leave the town. But such suggestions or plans were not in fact activated before the implementation of Plan D, Plan Dalet, in April and May. And Plan D itself was never launched in an orchestrated fashion by a formal leadership decision. Indeed, the various battalion and brigade commanders in the first half of April, and perhaps even later, seemed unaware that they were implementing Plan D. Unaware, because they had been doing it for so long. Previous Haganah master plans had referred either to the British or the Palestinian Arab militias, or a combination of the two, possibly aided by Arab volunteers from outside, as the possible enemy. Plan D was geared to an invasion by regular Arab armies. It was to be activated when the forces of the British government in the country will no longer be in existence, meaning that it was to be activated somewhere in the hiatus between the British withdrawal and the Arab invasion. When it emerged that no such hiatus would exist, the HGS prepared to activate the plan during the last week or two of by then largely nominal British rule. The plan called for the consolidation of Jewish control in and around the big Jewish and mixed towns, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, the sealing off of potential enemy routes into the country, the consolidation of a defense line along the borders, and the extension of Haganah protection to Jewish population centers outside the UN-sanctioned borders. In doing this, the plan called for the securing of the main interior roads, the siege of Arab towns and neighborhoods, and the conquest of forward enemy bases. To achieve these objectives, swaths of Arab villages, either hostile or potentially hostile, were to be conquered, and brigade commanders were given the option of destruction of villages, arson, demolition, mining of the ruins, or cleansing of militiamen, and taking control of the villages and leaving a garrison in place. The commanders were given discretion whether to evict the inhabitants of villages and urban neighborhoods sitting on vital access roads. So as I say, he keeps giving us evidence over and over that this was the plan, even though there wasn't, quote unquote, a plan. The original operational order of 2 April for the conquest of Al-Kastal had forbidden the Haganah troops from razing the village. In the same spirit, Yadin had initially instructed the Nahshon commanders to occupy sites if possible near villages and not to conquer them. But the follow-up order on 8 April to recapture Al-Kastal specifically ordered the destruction of its houses. This was indicative of the radical change of thinking in the HGS. In line with Plan D, Arab villages were henceforward to be leveled to prevent their reinvestment by Arab forces. The implication was that their inhabitants were to be expelled and prevented from returning. This is a report from a commander, Yitzhak Levy, on the 12th of April. The conquest of the village, Sheikh Badr, where is this village? Oh, this is Deir Yassin. Everybody knows about this. The conquest of the village was carried out with great cruelty. Whole families, women, old people, children were killed. Some of the prisoners moved to places of detention, including women and children, were murdered viciously by their captors. This was reported by the commander of this force. The most important immediate effect of the media atrocity campaign, however, was to spark fear and further panic flight from Palestine's villages and towns. And some people wonder if this was not the real message of Deir Yassin. That said, I think as far as conspiracy theories go, the idea that the Zionists, let's say, overdid it in Deir Yassin in order to scare everybody, that's not the most impossible idea to me. But I don't think the Zionists had to be instructed to be cruel to the Palestinians. They were very happy to do that, most of them. It just happened to be a very happy byproduct was that the news spread and the Palestinians, afraid that they were going to become the next Deir Yassin, they fled. So that's a very different story than the Arab leaders told them to leave, or they left on their own accord. Of course, you're going to run if you've been told that what the Jews come and do is murder everyone in your town and then dynamite your house. You're going to try to save your life. You're not going to stand there and wait to be murdered. And that's a very different narrative from, oh, the Arab leaders told them to leave. And that's why they left, which, as I say, that is the conspiracy theory. There's no evidence of that. And in fact, there's counter evidence. And here's some more testimony from Israelis. One participant, Gideon, I think this is a code name. My Jeep made the turn, and here at the entrance to the house opposite stands an Arab girl, stands and screams with eyes filled with fear and dread. She is all torn and dripping blood. Around her on the ground lie the corpses of her family. Did I fire at her? But why these thoughts? For we are in the midst of a battle, in the midst of conquest of the town. The enemy is at every corner. Everyone is an enemy. Kill, destroy, murder. Otherwise you will be murdered and will not conquer the town. Which, even if I were to grant to a soldier that this is war and you might have reacted that way, you have to realize this is still the Zionist and Israeli criminal response today. Today, a child is still a terrorist. A child screaming with the bodies of her family littered around her, she should still be shot too, because all terrorists deserve to die. That's the response of the Zionists. Now, what's my LOL quote from Morris after he gives us these mountains of evidence, which are backed up by mountains of footnotes, endnotes rather. Here he says, nowhere does the document speak of a policy or desire to expel the Arab inhabitants of Palestine or of any of its constituent regions. Nowhere is any brigade instructed to clear out the Arabs. So because the document doesn't say it, for Morris it doesn't count. Expulsions only count if it was part of a master plan. Otherwise, it was just an accident. It happened during the war. People's tempers ran high, and that's what was going on. Now, with all of this success, what is the new policy of the Haganah? It's not just that we're going to keep the Jewish land, we're going to take over new land. In retrospect, Operation Nahshon marked the start of the implementation of Plan D. But most of these villages lay in the territory designated in the partition resolution for Palestinian Arab sovereignty, which meant that securing the road or corridor to Jerusalem would involve an expansion of the prospective Jewish state's territory. So it wasn't simply a defensive war, the idea we were invaded. Plan D calls for the invasion of the Palestinian marked territory. So this again goes against the narrative of poor Israel. We were just attacked. We were just minding our own business. We didn't have anything to do with this. Not only did they ethnically cleanse a number of villages, but then they started moving into the Palestinian area as well. And later on, we'll see that they would go on to invade Lebanon. Now, what did the Jews do when they came to their, shall we say, new possessions? The empty Arab quarters were then thoroughly looted. This is referring to one of the instances in April. It was as if there was a contest between the different Haganah platoons stationed in Migdal, Ginosar, Yavniel, Ein Gev, who came in cars and boats and loaded all sorts of goods, refrigerators, beds, etc. Quite naturally, the Jewish masses in Tiberias wanted to do likewise. Old men and women, regardless of age, all are busy with robbery. Shame covers my face, recorded one Jewish leader. Arab Tiberias was no more. The evacuation of Arab Tiberias within days triggered the complete evacuation of a string of neighboring villages, among them Al-Ubaidiyah, Majdal, which is the birthplace of St. Mary Magdalene, and Guwir Abu Shusha. So this is what's happening is as soon as the Arabs were out, came in to steal all their stuff. And once again, this is Benny Morris that's writing it. This isn't some Palestinian propagandist who hates Jews. The evidence is all there. Morris just went into the archives and pulled the evidence out and then showed it to us. He was just naive enough to think that the Zionists would be willing to admit that this could be morally problematic. One Arab commentator later wrote that as daily convoys of refugees were departing for Gaza, the ALA troops acted as if the town were theirs and began to rob people and loot their homes. People's lives became worthless and women's honor was defiled. So he's pointing out here, this wasn't something that was only done by the Zionists. The ALA troops also behaved badly. And so it can't just be said that the Zionists were the only ones who committed atrocities. I think that's something that Morris does over and over. He does treat that and doesn't make this a one-sided narrative. The Haganah screening of the remaining inhabitants was unpleasant. Refugees were not allowed back. Property was vandalized, looted by soldiers and civilians from Tel Aviv on a massive scale. One Haganah document graphically describes the events in Manshia on the 18th of May. There I found a large crowd of women, children, and men who were looting everything: chairs, cupboards, and other furniture, household, kitchen utensils, sheets, pillows. Haga units tried to halt the looting, occasionally firing into the air or beating miscreants, but with incomplete success. The problem was that the troops too were involved, as one official reported a week later. I saw soldiers, civilians, military police, battalion police looting, robbing, while breaking through doors and walls. The heat of battle? I think not. The occupation of these areas was followed by large-scale looting and vandalizing of Arab property by Jewish troops and neighbors. Walter Eitan, dragged by acting American Consul General William Burdett to look at a house in Baca, reported, every single room in the house had been smashed up. The whole place looked as if a band of savages had passed through it. Keep in mind, remember, the Zionists always want to tell you that the Palestinians are human animals, that they're not real people. Listen to the description from one of their own, right? Walter Eitan is a Jew. It was not merely a question of ordinary theft, but of deliberate and senseless destruction. A portrait had been left hanging on the wall with the face neatly cut out with a knife. As we went from room to room, I felt more and more speechless and more ashamed. I could only express my great regret. Yeah, great regret. That's nice. And remember, the Arabs told people to leave. Remember, that's the narrative. Keep in mind that there's a bunch of refugees now streaming into these neighboring Arab countries. On the 5th of May, King Abdullah publicly called on every man of strength and wisdom who has left the country, let him return to the dear spot. No one should remain outside the country except the rich and the old. He thanked those who had remained in Palestine in spite of the tyranny now prevailing. A few days before, he had specifically pressed Bedouin refugees from the Beisan Valley to return. On the 5th through 7th of May, the ALA in radio broadcasts from Ramallah and Damascus forbade villagers from leaving, threatening that their homes would be demolished and their lands confiscated. Inhabitants who had fled were ordered to return. The broadcasts were monitored by the Haganah. The Arab military leaders are trying to stem the flood of refugees and are taking stern and ruthless measures against them. That's the quote from the Haganah report. So once again, the narrative that the Arab leaders told them to leave or they left of their own free will, even when they did leave because they were scared because of what they'd heard about what the Jews did to the Palestinians when they came to their villages, they were told to go back. King Abdullah told them to go back. So there's a counter narrative, which once again, Morris is pointing out here. Last thing I want to talk about today is a very ugly story, which isn't, I think, told enough, but people should hear about. It was referred to. I first heard about it, I think, from Ilan Pape and then Rashid Khalidi, but this is the actual documentation of it. This is the story of the poisoning of wells. Israeli desperation was such that two Palma Arab platoon scouts, David Mizrahi and Ezra Afghin, were sent to Gaza reportedly to poison wells as well as gather information. They were caught on the 22nd of May near Jabalia with thermos flasks containing water contaminated with typhoid and diphtheria also known as dysentery, according to King Farouk. Mizrahi and Afghin had apparently poured their concoction into one well before being captured and confessing. The two were executed on the 22nd of August. The Egyptians complained to London, but the Foreign Office thought it prudent to keep out, though one official minuted that the matter was so obnoxious that perhaps if the opportunity arose, Britain could express its disgust to the Israelis. Oh, that's so nice. Express the disgust of your planning to poison a civilian population with typhoid and diphtheria. Okay, that's the end of part 1. Thank you for your patience. As always, if you like this review, please hit like, hit subscribe. Please send this on to people who are open-minded enough to hear something different from the narrative of the Zionists from somebody who has Zionist sympathies, but is an Israeli historian. And I think throughout this book is generally fair. Towards the end of the book, we see a little bit more of his personal views come out, but it doesn't change the fact that a lot of this is documented and it doesn't look good for the Zionists. Consider sending a super thanks if you really like this, or if you'd like to see more of this in the future and you want to help support it, please consider becoming a member of my Patreon or becoming a member on YouTube. You'll get access to these videos before anyone else does, and you also have an opportunity to talk with me a bit more and give me input, send me in different directions. And you can also do that by buying books from my Amazon wishlist, which, as I say, is really at this point for 2025, because 2024 is almost fully committed to books that I already have. You can probably see them all lined up there in a particular order to deal with Palestine and Israel. And remember that a portion of the proceeds from all of these different channels are going to go to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which is something that I'm really particularly supporting with all of my reviews in 2024. Go check them out. They're a fantastic organization helping Palestinian children. As always, enjoy your reading.